At my cousin's graduation dinner, my uncle asked, "Still renting that tiny apartment?" I said, "No, I own the building you've been paying rent in for 6 years." The question landed the way my uncle's questions always did, with the particular warmth of a man who already knew the answer and just wanted to hear you confirm your own smallness out loud. Clifford Beaumont was 62 years old, broad-shouldered, loud in the specific way that people with modest accomplishments tend to be loud, and he had been asking me some version of this question since I was 24 and chose to work in property management instead of the corporate law track my family had decided was the only legitimate form of success. He was standing at the head of the private dining room at Hargrove's Steakhouse with his jacket open and his tie loosened, a glass of scotch in one hand and the satisfied posture of a man at the center of a celebration he believed he'd personally engineered, because his daughter Zara had just graduated from Duke with a degree in finance, and that was, as far as Cliff was concerned, a monument to his parenting. The room had about 30 people in it. My grandmother Eloise was at the far end of the table. My mother was next to her, and when Cliff asked the question about my apartment, about whether I was still renting that tiny place on Morrow Street, approximately 16 people heard him do it. I set down my water glass. I looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, and then I told him the truth. I need to explain what I'd been doing for the past 6 years, because the answer to Cliff's question didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen because I got lucky. It happened because I had been paying attention to things my family never thought to look at, building something they never thought to ask about, in the quiet, methodical way that people work when they've accepted that no one is watching and no one is waiting to applaud. I grew up in the Beaumont family. My mother, Lena, was Cliff's younger sister, which made me his niece and the family's unofficial case study in wasted potential. My grandfather had been a contractor, built custom homes in North Carolina for 40 years, and when he died, he left a modest estate split 3 ways between his 3 children. My mother got her share. Cliff got his. Their younger brother Rodney got his. Cliff used his share to buy a convenience store that he ran into the ground in 4 years, and then sold for a small loss. My mother put hers into a savings account and was still very proud of the interest it accumulated. I was 22 when my grandfather died, and I received nothing because the estate went to his children, not his grandchildren, which was his right, and I held no grievance about it. What I received instead was something better. 6 months working alongside him before he got sick, listening to him talk about properties and tenants and leverage and cash flow, about how real estate was patient money that worked while you slept. He was the only person in my family who had ever asked me what I wanted to build. I have thought about him almost every day since. I graduated from NC State with a degree in business administration and took a job at a property management company in Raleigh called Forest Realty Group, where I managed leasing for 3 residential buildings and learned the operational side of the business from the ground up. The pay was $38,000 a year, which was precisely the kind of salary that caused my Uncle Cliff to furrow his brow and say things like, "Well, hopefully it leads somewhere," at Christmas gatherings. My mother worried quietly and loudly simultaneously, which is a skill she had refined over decades. My cousin Zara, who was 12 at the time and already being groomed by Cliff for great things, once asked me at a family barbecue why I worked at an apartment building if I wasn't a maintenance person. I told her that was a good question and I'd explain when she was older. Meanwhile, I was saving. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone noticed, just consistently. 15% of every paycheck, then 20. Living in a 1-bedroom apartment on Morrow Street that cost me $840 a month in a building that I had mentally noted was undervalued, underleveraged, and owned by a landlord named Gus Petrakis, who was 68 years old and had mentioned twice in passing that he was thinking about retirement. I was paying attention. I had been paying attention for years. The first property I bought was a duplex in a neighborhood called Waverly Park in South Raleigh, which I purchased in the spring of my 26th year for $214,000, putting down $42,000 that I'd saved over 4 years, and borrowing the rest through a conventional 30-year mortgage at 4.2%. I rented both units the same week I closed escrow. The combined rental income was $2,400 per month against a mortgage payment of $891. My property manager at Forest, a woman named Claudette Reyes, who had been in the industry for 27 years and who became my most important professional mentor, reviewed my numbers before I signed and said, "You've done your homework. This is a solid buy." I did not tell my family. I thought about it and decided there was nothing to tell yet. A duplex was not impressive by any measure, and I knew what the reaction would be. Polite confusion from my mother, condescension from Cliff, a series of questions about whether I'd consulted a financial advisor that would circle back to the implication that I didn't know what I was doing. I had done this calculation before and I knew the result. So I said nothing, and I kept working. And 18 months later, I bought a second property, a 4-unit building in the same neighborhood for $380,000, again with a down payment I'd saved and the rental income from the duplex contributing to my purchasing power. I was 27. I had 6 rental units. My family thought I managed apartments for other people and lived in a small place on Morrow Street. Both of those things had been true. Neither of them was anymore. The building on Morrow Street came on the market in the winter of my 29th year. It was a 12-unit, 3-story brick building that Gus Petrakis had owned for 23 years, built in the 1980s, well-maintained but with rents that were below market because Gus had long-term tenants he didn't want to displace, and a management philosophy that prioritized stability over return. The asking price was $1.1 million. By that point, my portfolio had grown to 14 units across 3 properties. I had refinanced the duplex to pull out equity, and I had a relationship with a community lender named First Carolina's Credit Union, whose commercial real estate officer, a man named Dale Stubbs, had been lending to small investors for 21 years, and who told me, after reviewing my financials, that I was one of the most disciplined borrowers he'd seen come through his office at my age. We structured a commercial loan at 5.1% with a 20-year amortization. I put down $275,000, On a cold Thursday morning in February, I closed on the building on Morrow Street and became the landlord of 12 residential units, including the apartment occupied by my uncle Clifford Beaumont and his wife Nadine, who had moved there 3 years earlier after selling their house during a financially turbulent period that Cliff described to the family as a strategic transition. They were paying $1,150 per month. They were among Gus Petrakis' long-term tenants he hadn't wanted to displace. I honored that commitment. I kept their rent exactly where it was. I sent them a letter on Cascade Property Group letterhead, my LLC, which had no name attached to it publicly, informing them of the ownership transfer and providing new payment instructions. Cliff called the number on the letter to ask questions. A property manager I'd hired named Darnell Osei answered and handled the call professionally and with no indication whatsoever that the owner of the building was Cliff's niece. Cliff paid his rent to Cascade Property Group for 6 years without once asking who owned the company. I cannot tell you why this surprises me as much as it does, but it does. The escalation of Cliff's behavior over those 6 years was not dramatic, it was chronic. It was the specific kind of family condescension that operates on a low frequency, never loud enough to cause a scene, always present enough to do consistent damage. It was Cliff at my cousin Dion's wedding, asking me if I'd thought about going back to school for something more serious. It was Cliff at my grandmother Eloise's 70th birthday, telling me that the property management industry was a dead end, and that I should consider pivoting before I got too old to start over. It was Cliff at Thanksgiving, 3 years running, steering conversations about careers and success toward Zara, and pointedly not toward me, as though I were a piece of furniture in the room rather than a person at the table. My mother absorbed this because she'd been absorbing Cliff's opinions her entire life and it had become reflexive. My grandmother saw it and said nothing because she believed family cohesion was more valuable than individual vindication, which was a generous philosophy and one I respected even when it cost me. I absorbed it too for a while, in the way that you absorb things when confronting them seems like more energy than it's worth. But I was not passive, I was building. And the thing about building is that eventually you have built something, and it exists whether or not anyone has been paying attention. The person who helped me understand the full scope of what I'd created was my accountant, Rosalind Tate, a CPA with 30 years of experience who specialized in real estate investment portfolios and who had been filing my returns since year 2 of my ownership journey. Rosalind was small, precise, and completely without sentimentality when it came to numbers, which made her the most useful person in my professional life. At our annual review in January of the year Zara graduated, Rosalind laid out my portfolio across her conference table in a document she'd been compiling for years. 22 units across 6 properties, total market value approximately $4.3 million, outstanding debt approximately $1.9 million, net equity approximately $2.4 million, annual gross rental income $312,000, annual net operating income after expenses and debt service approximately $89,000. She handed me the document and said, in the same tone she used for everything, "You've built a real business. This is genuinely impressive." I told her thank you. She said, "Don't thank me. I just ran the numbers. You made them." I drove home from that meeting and sat in my car in the parking garage of the building I owned on Meridian Avenue for about 10 minutes, not celebrating exactly, just sitting with the weight of what the numbers meant. I had been doing this for 11 years without anyone in my family knowing, without anyone asking, without anyone offering a single word of acknowledgement or support. The number on the document was $2.4 million. I folded it and put it in my glove compartment and went upstairs. The invitation to Zara's graduation dinner arrived by text from Cliff himself, which was unusual because Cliff typically had Nadine handle family communications. The text said, "Duke graduation dinner, June 14th, Hargrove's Steakhouse, 7 p.m. Family event. Bring a date if you have one." The last sentence had the flavor of a small pointed comment dressed as an afterthought. Cliff knew I was single and had known this for years and found ways to reference it with the frequency of a man who considered it a relevant data point about my life choices. I almost didn't go. I talked to my therapist, Dr. Yvonne Bridges, a licensed psychologist who had been helping me work through what she called enmeshed family dynamics and anticipatory shame responses for the past 2 years, and she asked me what outcome I was hoping for by attending. I told her I wanted to support Zara, who had worked genuinely hard and deserved congratulations that had nothing to do with Cliff. Dr. Bridges said that was a healthy reason to attend. She also said I should think carefully about whether I wanted to disclose anything about my finances, and if so, why, and what I hoped the disclosure would accomplish. I told her I hadn't decided yet. She said that was fine. I showed up to Hargrove's in a dress I'd bought in Charlotte the previous spring, arrived on time, hugged Zara in the lobby and told her she'd done something real, and went in. The dinner moved through its stages the way these events always did. Appetizers and wine and the particular performative warmth of a family that gets along better in public than in private. Zara talked about the finance program and her job offer. She'd been accepted into an analyst training program at a bank in Charlotte, which was genuinely excellent, and I said so sincerely. Cliff accepted the compliments on his behalf with the grace of a man who had personally graduated from Duke. Nadine talked about the apartment, a comment that should have flagged something in my brain but didn't because I was managing a conversation with my grandmother on the other side. The main course arrived. The room got warmer and louder in the way that rooms do when people have been drinking wine for 90 minutes. And then Cliff, mid-conversation with a man named Bart from his golf club, turned to me with that expression, the open-faced, benevolent expression of a man about to manage someone, and said, "Simone, how are things? Still renting that little place on Morrow Street?" Something clarified in me. Not an explosion. Not a decision made in anger. More like a very long equation arriving at its answer. I looked at him and I said very calmly, "No. I moved out of Morrow Street about 4 years ago." He nodded with the faint condescension of a man waiting for the rest. I let him wait for exactly 3 seconds. Then I said, I own the building now. I have for 6 years. You and Nadine have been paying rent to my LLC. The silence was immediate and total. Cliff's face did 3 things in rapid succession that I will remember for the rest of my life. First, it went blank. Genuine processing interruption, the look of a person whose operating system has encountered an input it doesn't have a category for. Then it went red, but not the red of anger. The red of something closer to embarrassment or exposure, a flush that started at his collar and moved upward with uncomfortable speed. Then it went still, the stillness of a man recalculating every interaction he's had in a significant time period and not liking where the math is landing. Nadine, sitting 2 seats away, had heard it. The man named Bart from the golf club had heard it. My mother, across the table, had heard it, and I watched her set down her fork with the careful precision of someone who needed her hands to be occupied with something neutral. My grandmother Eloise turned toward me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Not shock. More like the quiet look of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific thing to happen. I stayed completely calm. I had not planned this speech. I had not rehearsed this moment. But I had built the thing that made it real, and it turns out that when the truth is already the most extraordinary version of events, you don't need to embellish it. Cliff said, "That's not possible." Not accusatory, genuinely uncertain. I pulled out my phone, not for drama, but because I had learned a long time ago that documentation ends, arguments that denial would extend indefinitely, and opened the property record search for Wake County, North Carolina, typed in the address on Morrow Street, and slid the phone across the table toward him. Owner of record, Cascade Property Group, LLC. Registered agent and sole member, Simone Beaumont. Cliff picked up my phone with a hand that was not entirely steady and read the screen for about 8 seconds. He put the phone down. He looked at me. He said, Since when?" I told him since February of my 29th year, which was 6 years and 4 months ago by my count. He said, "And you never said anything." It was not quite a question. I told him no one had ever asked. The table was very quiet. Zara, to her enormous credit, said, "Wait, Simone, you own real estate?" I told her yes, a small portfolio. She asked how many units. I said 22. She looked at her father and then back at me with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. Cliff pushed back from the table slightly. He said, "This is something you should have told the family." And I said, with complete composure and every ounce of 11 years of patience behind it, "I would have, if anyone had ever asked what I was doing with my time." My mother cried in the parking lot afterward, which I had predicted. Not sad crying, the other kind, the complicated kind that doesn't have a clean label, where relief and grief and pride and guilt are all moving through the same moment. She kept saying she hadn't known, and I kept saying I understood, and both of us were telling the truth, and the truth was not entirely comforting. I had kept it from her too, not out of malice, but out of a learned caution that came from years of understanding that my family's capacity to receive good news from me was limited by their prior investment in the narrative that I was the one who hadn't figured it out yet. Changing that narrative required evidence they couldn't dismiss, and I had waited until I had enough of it. My mother understood this, I think, even if understanding it hurt. She hugged me in the parking lot for a long time without saying anything, and that felt like its own kind of answer. The following day, she called me and asked if I would sit down with her and walk her through what I'd built, and I said yes, and we spent 4 hours at my dining room table going through the portfolio documentation while she asked questions in the earnest catching-up way of someone who had just discovered a room in a house they thought they knew. She cried twice more during that 4 hours. Both times I let her, and then we kept going. Cliff called 3 days after the dinner. I almost didn't answer, for the same reason I almost didn't go to the dinner in the first place. But I answered because I am not afraid of this particular conversation, and because avoiding it would require ongoing management that I did not want to do. He said he'd had time to think. I said that was good. He said he wanted to understand how I'd financed everything, whether I was carrying too much debt, whether I'd had professional guidance, whether the LLC structure was appropriate. I listened to all of this. I recognized it for what it was. Cliff performing expertise in the absence of any actual ground to stand on, reverting to the only dynamic he knew because the alternative was acknowledging that he'd been wrong about me for 20 years. I told him I had a CPA named Rosalind Tate, 30 years of experience, who reviewed my financials annually. I told him I had a commercial lender, Dale Stubbs at First Carolinas Credit Union, 21 years in commercial real estate. I told him I had a property management mentor, Claudette Reyes, 27 years in the industry. I had not arrived at this loan and I was not operating without professional infrastructure. He said, "I just want to make sure you're protected." I said I appreciated that. I also said very quietly, "Cliff, I've been doing this for 11 years. The time to make sure I was protected was 11 years ago, when I was 22 and nobody in this family asked what I was planning to build. I built it anyway. I'm fine." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, fair enough." That was the whole conversation. Zara called me the following week, which I had not expected. She was 22, newly graduated, about to start a real career in finance, and she said she'd been thinking about the dinner and wanted to ask me some questions. Not about Cliff, about the portfolio itself, about how I'd started, what I'd learned, what I wished I'd known earlier. We talked for 2.5 hours. I told her about the duplex in Waverly Park and the calculations I'd run before I bought it. I told her about Claudette Reyes and what it meant to have a mentor who actually knew the industry. I told her about patience, about the specific discipline of building something slowly when everyone around you is measuring success by speed and visibility. She asked if she could see the portfolio document sometime, not because she planned to copy my strategy, but because she wanted to understand the structure. I said absolutely. I emailed her Rosalind's annual review summary the next day. She called me back after she read it and said quietly, "Oh, Simone, this is incredible." I told her I knew. Then I told her that the most important thing in the document wasn't the equity number. It was the date on the first page, which showed when I'd bought the duplex. It showed that I'd been 26 years old and nobody had believed in it except me. She understood what I was telling her. She is her father's daughter in many ways, but she is sharp and she is her own person in the ways that matter, and I think she's going to be fine. The dynamics in my extended family shifted after that dinner in ways that were subtle and irreversible. The way temperature changes in a room when someone opens a window. Nothing dramatic, but suddenly the air is different and you can't close the window back to where it was. Cliff still talked. He was always going to talk. But the particular frequency of his commentary about my choices had dropped significantly. With the notable exception of a moment at my grandmother Eloise's birthday gathering in August, when he started to say something about whether I'd considered diversifying beyond real estate, and my grandmother, who had been sitting quietly in her chair saying almost nothing for the better part of an hour, looked up from her tea and said, "Clifford, she owns 22 units. Let it rest." That was the entirety of Eloise's contribution to the conversation. Cliff let it rest. My grandmother looked at me with an expression that contained approximately 40 years of watching and waiting and understanding that time eventually does the work that arguments cannot, and I looked back at her and thought about my grandfather, who had asked me what I wanted to build when I was 21 and barely knew the answer yet. Would I think he would have appreciated the building on Morrow Street? I think he would have liked that it was brick. In the months following the dinner, something I had not fully anticipated began to happen. People started asking. Not Cliff. Cliff was navigating his own complicated process that I had decided to leave alone unless he came to me, but other family members, extended cousins, my mother's friends, people who had heard the story through the network that family gossip creates. They asked carefully, with the somewhat embarrassed quality of people who suspect they should have been asking sooner. I answered honestly and without resentment, because resentment requires ongoing maintenance and I had other things to do with my energy. My mother started telling people about the portfolio in the way that she had once told people about Zara's Duke acceptance, with the particular pride of someone who had rediscovered something she'd always had. I found this touching and slightly hilarious and said nothing about either of those feelings to anyone except Dr. Bridges, who found it textbook and clinically interesting and told me I was handling the attention with exactly the right amount of detachment. I said I'd had 11 years of practice with the opposite. She said that was true and we moved on. Dale Stubbs at First Carolinas called me in October with a question about a property that was coming to market in a neighborhood I'd been watching for 2 years. A 20-unit building, solid bones, owner looking to retire. Just similar situation to Gus Petrakis and the Morrow Street property. The asking price was $1.8 million. My current debt-to-equity ratio, per Rosalind's most recent review, was conservative enough to support the acquisition with a reasonable commercial loan structure. I drove to the building on a Saturday morning and walked the exterior and the common areas and 2 vacant units that the owner's agent showed me. The units were well maintained. The bones were solid. The rents were under market in the specific way that suggested a patient landlord and a long-term tenant base. I called Dale from the parking lot and told him I wanted to move forward on a preliminary basis. He said he'd get me numbers by Wednesday. I drove home, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in the apartment I'd moved to 4 years ago. 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, a building I owned on Meridian Avenue, and I looked out the window at the street below and thought about what it cost to build something from nothing. Not in money, though it cost plenty in money, but in the years of being dismissed and unseen and underestimated and choosing over and over to keep working anyway. The building on Morrow Street was brick and 12 units and a monthly rental roll that had paid its own mortgage for 6 years. The duplex in Waverly Park was 2 families who paid their rent on time and had nowhere they needed to be. 22 units was 22 proofs. The 20-unit building in the new neighborhood would be 22 more. Not because I needed the validation, because my grandfather had told me that real estate was patient money, and I had been patient and the money had been very good. And I still had a long way to go. Rosalind Tate's annual review that December was the best one she'd ever put together for me. She handed me the document across her conference table and said, as she always said, that she'd just run the numbers. I said, as I always said, thank you. Then she paused. Rosalind did not pause as a rule and said, I want you to know that when you came to me 11 years ago with your first duplex financials, I told my husband about you that evening. I said there's a 26-year-old who has done her homework and knows what she's doing, and I want to watch what she builds. I looked at her. I said I hadn't known that. She said she'd never told a client before, but she'd been doing this for 30 years, and she didn't think she'd be doing it for 30 more. And some things were worth saying before the window closed. I drove home in the December dark with the document on the passenger seat and the kind of quiet that comes after something real has been acknowledged. And I thought about Cliff at that dinner table, and the question he'd asked, and the answer I'd given, and all the years between when he asked the question and when I had the answer to give. He'd meant to make me feel small. That's the thing about questions like that. They're designed to confirm a story that someone has already decided is true. The story he'd decided about me was wrong, had been wrong for 11 years, had been wrong every single time he'd asked me some version of it at every family gathering across a decade of holidays and dinners and celebrations that never once belonged to me. And on the night that it finally, actually mattered, the night I'd sat at a table where someone handed me the exact question I'd spent 11 years building the answer to. I told the truth, and the truth had done what the truth does when you've been patient enough to let it build. It landed so precisely and so completely that not one person in that room needed me to say another word. I didn't need to hurt him. I just needed to answer the question. And I did.